of my master's thesis that I did in SUNY, which is about fire occurrence modeling across the Americas. Um, so yeah, I'm gonna talk a little. It will be quick. It will be kind of like the more important parts. And also my findings, challenges that I found while I was doing this. And first, I had the concern or like big curiosity of how can we understand fires? Um, can we study frequency, intensity, where fire is happening? How can we do that? Regarding also considering climate change, vulnerabilities that maybe some populations are exposed to. So I was super interested in how can I study, how can I approach that? And that's how using remote sensing data, there's a bunch of there's almost like 20 years of information regarding fires um, that can give us a lot of insights of what is happening, how much is how frequent, where exactly, and those tools are mostly measured through satellite data, which are very has like a very scientific uh, background, and also is open source, so is very accessible to people and it can be implemented in different tools. Um, and once I have the data, I was like, okay, now I know where is the fire, and I have the data. So what can I do with that? Like now what? So that's why I was like, okay, I will try to model. I will try to gather all the data to try to see if there is like any relation, like to build a model. And so that's and I found literature that also other people try to do the same. And so I was gathering all of that information, and then I have like these two research questions. That was to what extent I can model forest fire occurrences um, across different climate zones, and what are the most influential variables contributing to fire occurrences in each region. I'm not gonna go so deep in my methodology. I just wanna show you like the most important parts. The first thing is I was looking for all the available data that I can use, and the more important was there was a data set about fire. So I have like my variable will be fire and not fire, like if you see in a map. And then I was able to find data of land cover, precipitation, temperature, net primary productivity, and my the socioeconomic data, population, gross domestic product, slope, which is more topographic, and road density, which is also talking about like um, the human impact in the landscape. So since this was all in kind of the same resolution, have the same temporal coverage, I was like, okay, this will be useful. Um, and at the beginning, this data has global extent. And at the beginning, with my advisor, he was like, okay, so let's do a global model. And I was like, okay, yeah, I will try. But it was a lot of data, a lot of data. And even with the most powerful computer, it was like, oh my gosh, I spent a lot of time trying to grab the data and like trying to I don't know, apply like some normalizations to like compress information, but it was just a lot of data, like so many pixels. Still, like these could be like in remote sensing, 500 meters could be considered as coarse data, like high, like not very specific, but still like when you want to run like a global model, it is a lot. So that's why I just went to the Americas. And also I but it's still like Americas was not small enough to just make like one model for like all Americans. Like the model supposed to be trained with all type of data. But again, the computational challenges made us to look ways to organize and to develop models per like we came with climate zones according to literature, and also this was like I was not able to find. I found in the literature like a map of um, zones that were dependent and independent, but I was not able to get the layer. So this was kind of the same, kind of it followed the same pattern. So that's why I went to this. So I basically have like two main regions, North America and Central America and South America. And I have like one model for climate zone. So I have four in the north and three in South America because yeah, continental we don't have continental. so um so once I have all my data and all of that, I was looking for different modeling algorithms. I started using random forest and also I took a machine learning course for this, and the professor was like, you always you want to start with like very basic things, and like you just go further if your problem is complex. So I started with linear regression, like, but I was like no, and like so I went further. I tried with random forest, which is not enough. And so I was recommended to use XGBoost, which is also use trees, like is kind of an upgrade of random forest, but it's tree based. Um, but it's very good to treat nonlinear problems like wildfires occurrence. And also one of the important things was, and the challenges that I found was like, I had so many data of non-fire, and like, and I know that like in the field, it looks a lot of burn data, but like modeling, it was like just fire was considered rare. So like, how can I handle that? How can my model will not be like biased enough to just not never uh, not never predict fire? So that's also one of the reasons why I chose this algorithm, because it's supposed to handle this imbalance. Um, and this was kind of my general approach on how I ended up preparing my data to get into the algorithm. Um, One of the most important things when you try to model, like develop a geospatial model, is that you need to make sure that your model is spatial independent, temporal and spatial independent. That means that you cannot train your model in one part and then test your model, because you can introduce a bias. You can just, your model maybe is just memorizing rather than learning. So that's why the spatial and temporal was, and also another like a big step for me, like to I'm gonna make sure that my test is not included in my training. So it was like, again, how to organize data. At first I begin with one fire, 15 on fire, um, but also that was not identifying many fires. So I used an algorithm that is called near miss, that's supposed to make a balance and reduce, but the balance, but reducing the maybe the abundance of information that the 15 fires give you. Like try to resume and like try to just take the most important differences from those pixels. So basically, I just put this to just show you. I use like many years for train, and I use different years. I don't know how. So I make sure that I use enough years to train, and then that my test years were also not very, were like between the normal values. There were like normal years, but also like some of them were like draw like uh, this and I also make sure that I didn't train in very um, abnormal years. Like these years are like the normal between 2001 and 2018. Um, so yeah. Wait, I think
Or escape.
it is it's me. Yeah, you were sharing your screen.
Se parece más a la tierrita. Oh,
Wow. Okay, so yeah, I just used a bunch of years, make sure that my model was temporally independent. Uh, this is just to know how many pixels I use and like the amount of data. Like this takes a lot of computational effort, so that is a important thing to know when you try to do that. And I like the tropical zone and the continental zone were very challenging for me to process the data. Some things I could do in my computer, and for these two specifically, I needed to use like very high potency and like
Again,
32.
gaming computer.
Yeah, 32 cores and things like that. This is how, so this is after the undersampling that I did to try to balance and try to just use the most important pixels to train the model. Um, I have these metrics are very used and like very familiar with the modeling and all of that. Very general too. This just show you how good or how just show you that, but also when you generate these metrics, you should be aware that this is only in your like training and test. But I will show you later that doesn't translate in real life sometimes. So these are another metrics that I use, and the feature importance that shows you. Sorry, the feature importance shows you like when one variable influence, it shows you, for example, if the slope is high and it's up, it will show you. I'm gonna explain it later, but you can see if your slope is high, that the occurrence is likely to happen or less likely. Like you can see with that with the sharp values. Um, yeah, I have like acceptable metrics for my for different zones. Some of the zones were better than others, but overall the model like achieved um good results in terms of trying to predict fire or like the most the most important these called like these rows are the more important for me. It is challenging, it's not perfect, but in terms of like modeling, it was good results. But then the results, I don't know if it's very clear, but these are kind of the total areas, and this is I just showed the difference. Like the model overestimate the total surface of burn areas, and also like as I previously said before, you can see like in here in the arid zone, we can like the slope, we can see when the slope is low, it is less likely to occur, and when the slope gets like higher, it is like more likely, it is like to associate with fire occurrence. And then we have open shrublands, which is when when there is uh, no presence, there is likely to occur. The temperature. So I have all the rankings, but yeah. So when I wanna kind of highlight is my model had good metrics, but in real life, because there's so many things that like other variables that could happen, so the results will never be so perfect. But yeah, so approximately like it was overestimating like in some parts, like so the normal values were around 2000, and it was overestimating around like 400. So yeah. And yeah, this is for the South American tropical zone. Like in here, it's like different because also it's not only overestimating, but it's also underestimating. So here's where I was like, what is happening? And like, how can I do to understand this better? And I went to like for my discussion and all of that, I went to the literature to try to see if there were like studies or things that help my discussion. And most of the things were like we cannot predict how people will behave. Like some people are using some like so my precipitation population maybe is not reflecting fully how the fire behaves there. So maybe how can I? So my questions were like, how can I include other variables to make the prediction better? But this was the started my starting point and kind of the reason why I went to the HDNR to try to understand fire dynamics more in a human side, and like how can, if we want to produce, because we have all the data and we have like all the numbers, but if we really want these to be efficient, we need to understand like human behavior. And yeah, so with the implementations, also the data that I'm using depends on a satellite. And there are many, like, depends on the time of the satellite, like went through. Like, it's not that the fire started and the satellite will capture yes or yes. It could like end it before, and so the fire was not, or also it maybe the surface is not perfect. So there are some limitations even with my input data. Um, Computational limit, the class imbalance that I talk about. When you are using these, you see fire is rare, so that is a problem when you try to model data. And the human emissions that not only influences could be captured in GIS products. And yeah, so in conclusion, the model was well calibrated at modeling metrics, but for real world data, the performance varies, and maybe there are variables that are difficult to measure, but in the real data, they have effect and influence. So you can see that that is not so possible to model. But yeah, is it's just like I think this work is a proof that it's still like a lot of work to do in the fire science, and especially what is like early warning system and fire management. There is a lot to do with the people because it is not enough to just use a bunch of satellite data. It will never be enough. And yeah, at the end, the nature of fire means the decision of someone, like to start a fire or not. And yeah, so thank you so much. Gracias. And if you have any thoughts and concerns or feedback, I'm here to listen. Thank you.
We'll continue with Joel. And then, or go with the questions.
Let's do some questions.
Yeah.
And then, yeah.
Great question, Sheyla.
Yeah.
That's really cool. The residual maps are really interesting, And so do you have a feel for why the North America and South America give really different residual patterns? So like, North seems to be overestimation and South has a mix, right? But there's a bunch of underestimation in the South. Guesses?
Well, it could be like more of the use of fire that we have, but also like how um how can I say this? How the institutions manage fire in the North and in South America. I think here fire still happen, but there are a bunch of like prescribed burn programs and like more institutionalized I don't know how to say that, but more efforts through agency and like through the management rather than in South America is more like we're still well, like we don't know exactly, like we're just learning, and some countries already have the figures of prescribed burn and controlled burns, but it's not like it's not strong enough yet. So I think that maybe like the fire uses like is also reflected here. Like it's less is like I don't know. The conclusion is kind of is we're gonna if we try to model fires in South America, like it's very hard to just estimate, like because it depends a lot of people uses and behavior.
Yeah. That's interesting just because we tend to put out fire way too much. So actually the overestimation in the US makes sense from an institutional perspective. You would predict that because you don't have an institutional variable in your model.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that makes sense as a conclusion.
Go ahead.
No, please.
Thank you. This was very interesting and insightful. I'm from outside of the field, so I don't understand the specificity of the technical aspect, but I am interested in that human dimensions that you mentioned, and how would modeling fire behavior be used to maybe model people's behavior and the interactions between people and fires in the future? Or, in other words, how can we use this information to inform practices to improve that interaction?
I think like if I have to suggest, I will go to the second path that is like use this, like maybe to know the areas where we possible are gonna have like where the conditions like physical conditions like meteorological conditions are giving you a more prone fire situation, and that you need to be kind of ready to that, because I think it would be very hard to include, I don't know, I haven't seen like to include human behavior in a model, like it's very hard to capture that. So it's like how I think this will help to, okay, we have this information now, we need to inform this, people need to know like places that are highly vulnerable to fire, like high prone to fire, and like we need to use that, and not like we don't need to expect that a model will tell us what to do. We need to use that and like empower ourselves and make decisions using that. I think it could be still useful to see to highlight areas that need more attention than others, but to just expect that it will show us we will have what will happen, it is very difficult. So I think that the way is just how to like we need to understand that we need to use the technology to our favor and like not expect the technology to solve like situations like that.
Thank you.
I have a question. In terms of the scale of analysis, if you were to pursue those next steps, to try to understand what's going on more from the social, because clearly there are a lot of variables that might be behind some of those patterns that you see. What do you think is a scale of analysis? Because it seems like the whole continent might be impossible if you want to integrate that granularity in terms of what's going on the ground.
Mhm.
And I know you want to do your PhD in Paraguay, so maybe that's one area where you want to scale down, or like, what's your thought on scale?
So I like that I started with this global data because that also makes me see like that I need maybe more specificity. So I need to go down. And if I will look to products that will help me, like available products, I don't know, maybe I will go with Sentinel that has 10 meters, but also I need to be able that all the other data I can have like in 10 meters or I can resemble. Oh, and also like it's tricky. When it comes to scale, I think it's very tricky because there are some, maybe you don't have meteorological data at 10 meters and you need to downscale like your 500 meters. So it's like a trade-off. And but I don't know, it depends on kind of the patterns that you find and like trying to go down, but be careful that you like, oh, we need to be careful that we are so gonna have other resources that will back up. Like I decided to work in this scale because most of the global data set was in that scale. And yeah, that give me like two things. Oh, now we understand why all the models are like 1 kilometer or like 5 kilometers because for computational efforts, but also it makes me think, oh, but what if I want to go like more specific? Like, what if there's like I need to be more local? But of course, I cannot be I cannot do like many countries at the same time, like I cannot use Sentinel for the whole continent because that will be a lot of computational like processing. So yeah, it is very tricky. But if I like for my visa, I'll try to use like more local data. But probably there will definitely be more constraints. I don't know. Yeah.
I had a question related to scale I was gonna ask.
Yeah, sure, of course.
Question, in a similar way or the slightly different way. So I think like I'm a geographer. I like thinking about scale, and I think thinking about scale with regard to remote sensing and analysis of the type that you're discussing right now is like of a particular understanding of scale, and like it makes sense for like the modeling purposes and how you put it together statistically to like do that. I'm wondering about how you integrate or what do you think about? You don't have to have like a cold, like a solid answer for it right now, but that's like thinking about bringing in human perceptions because what I heard was about like we can't like the model doesn't bring into it like why people make decisions about what they do, and so if we were to think about like that piece, like trying to like talk to people to understand how they make decisions, and then bring some of that as variables into the model to perhaps make it more accurate or reflective, as what I heard how I interpreted some of what you were saying, then that I think also introduces like a scalar question because would it, like, and maybe that's what you're talking about, like, is it like focusing on the specific region of scale? So like these producers or people in this particular area, you might be able to like talk with like ranchers and soy farmers and indigenous peoples and MADES or like, environmental agencies and government institutions within like an area and survey them or talk with them to understand their decision processes and then feed that in. But if you were going to take that across, like at a much larger, like actual regional scale, I think there might be challenges. So I'm just curious what you think about that.
I mean, yeah. In that case, it will be easier, like maybe, and even if it will be easier to just create like a raster with, I don't know, if we can put values to just for us be a reference of how human will behave. But of course, that would be data that we need to generate on the field. So like it will not be possible to have like a continental like layer for that. It would be very local, but that could be combined with like the other information.
There are a few things that come to mind that might be, of course, it's so hard to model how people make decisions. And I know there is agent-based modeling, and I don't know if that would be, like decision trees that help you, create agents on the maps and how they make decisions. I don't know if that would be a potential avenue to take this work. It's completely outside of the realm of what I understand, but things like tenure, like integrating who owns the land. And
Yeah.
I'm thinking of the work of some of Jan's students and colleagues on kind of categorizing different types of frontier spaces might be interesting, because if you go back to your map, you can clearly see, the arc of deforestation of the Amazon where all that fire is happening. Here, right? And, if I look at Bolivia, which is the only context that I kind of know, I can already see like, oh, this is Beni where I work, and these are savannas, and this might be underestimated because it's not forest and it's savanna. And these are areas that have already been burned so much that maybe that's what they are overestimating. So if you go down to that scale, it might be easier to do a case study, right?
Yeah.
To try to identify what variables, whether it's type of vegetation or tenure or old versus new frontiers, things like that might be helpful.
Yeah, this could be like a starting point for other things, but
Yeah,
maybe, I will not need to run like a new model like for the whole continent or the climate zone, but I can improve one for that specific zone.
Can I ask a related question? No, since we're going on scale and stuff. So just to clarify, so you like that shows the whole continent, right? Or the part of the continent that you modeled, but you had separate models for each ecoregion.
Like that's the tropical zone. So each model only is training with like that zone data and
Because that's the tropical zone. And then it produces one model for that whole zone, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So are you familiar with this term stationarity? So like that the model could be different depending on what area of that you look at, right? So like if you subsample that, right?
Yeah.
You could have it could come with a completely different solution if you cut it in half one way or the other, right? I mean, we see a clear line of red versus blue, right, on that southern arc that Andrea is talking about, right? And so, I mean, maybe that's because the model should actually be different in one part of that versus the other, right? And so this idea of looking at like, there's different modeling that you can do to do that, but that could be part of the issue too, that you're using one global model, but actually it's some models.
Yeah, I mean, and since our first idea, like with my advisor, was to use global models, and like, so I try to keep it like general, but actually here these regions, like these are as like also general, because I know that the tropical has like their own zones, like within it has like sub-arid, and like, I don't know, there are many, like within these areas there are many others with like inside of that. One of my committee members was like, oh yeah, maybe if you do on those like regions, and I was like, yeah, I just defend that. I don't want to defend it.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it was like, but since our like main focus was to do like global, it was like, how to like make it efficient. But but also I think works for a starting point to see like, oh, how can we go from this, to like more specifics. So that's that's my little work.
Are we gonna stop at 10 till or an hour? We can also just have like a broader conversation. I don't have to present anything. It's 40.
Oh,
I think maybe we should do that.
Yeah.
Just to like not rush or push anything. Cool.
I want to talk about.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I could, but it doesn't. I don't know if it's really like of relevance.
What about the fires?
No, this doesn't have to do with fires.
I don't know about this.
This is something different, and more speculative. Sure, I'll just share some ideas. Why not?
You can quote if you want.
Oh, okay.
Still of you still cannot find what happened. That's tough. Ruptures.
So this is totally different insofar as it's very speculative. I'm not presenting like results or anything like that. It's more of like a reflection on some work that I've been doing, and also like thinking about like this theme for the semester. So fires, floods, and droughts. So talking about fires at a more regional level, and then I've been thinking a lot about flood and drought for some time in the Paraguay and Chaco, and how they relate to like climate change adaptation, and like thinking about possibilities and pathways to think through and with that. So one of the big, I think, challenges in the Paraguay and Chaco, in many parts of it, not certainly in all parts of it, but in a lot of parts of it, are actually this like dialectics, natural dialectic of flood and drought. What I mean by that, two seemingly opposed kind of an extreme climatic events that come together in different ways and really impact people's lives and livelihoods and well-being. So these are two images of the same road. This is an entrance road to the community of Pozo Hondo on the border of Paraguay, Argentina, and Bolivia. And I was there shortly around the same time that this image of this truck was taken. On the left, it's dust. It's very dry. It had been a long drought period, so it's almost 1 year without rain, and the situation is critical. And then, I was there doing field research, and then like a month later, I got a WhatsApp image from my friend of this picture on the same road. So, rains came, very torrential rains came. It's also along the Pilcomayo River, which is a river that's known to be quite dynamic. It's like one of the highest sediment carrying rivers in the world, and it floods its borders quite a bit. But you have these like really significant challenges of like dealing with no water or dealing with way too much water. And then there's these small windows of time generally where there's like a good amount of water. Farhana Sultana often calls climate change like a crisis of like too much water, too much, too little, too soon, too late. So like climate change is being like too much, too soon, too little, too late around water and like the delivery of water. I think it's a helpful way of thinking about it. And it also comes into play in a lot of these dynamics. So we can see this repeated over time in the Paraguayan Chaco and different areas of the Chaco. So a lot of it is this like questions of drought, and these are all images of very recent drought, but you can find, I have images going way back in like news reporting. So you have this United Nations report from 2020, just talking about drought and its effects on indigenous livelihoods in the Chaco. But you see in like 2022, this image on the lower left is from a news reporting that's really talking about fires and droughts coming together to really be grave situations for people's livelihoods, particularly indigenous peoples. And then earlier this year in 2025, two different reflections about the impacts of drought on well-being in the Chaco, particularly for indigenous peoples, but also for ranchers. So you have this like subtitle, you can't read fully there, but it says drought in the Chaco, live or survive. And it has a picture of a dry, what's called a tajamar, which is a common water storage infrastructure used in the Chaco. And the other one is of dried crops. But on the other hand, you have, boom, these images, which is like the Chaco as well being flooded. So you have these dynamics, and this is from April. So the lower left-hand image says the lower Chaco is underwater and without assistance. So this is 4 months later than those other headlines. And I was in the Paraguay and Chaco in February of this year, and talking with friends about the extremity of the droughts and how they're dealing with it, and the fact that there was like literally no water to drink. And then just a couple, like 2-3 months later, there was these big rains that came through and started to replenish like water supplies, but also like create these challenges. And these are challenges as well, not only for indigenous peoples, but also producers, as you see in the image pro ranching. This headline down here, where they're having an interview with a rancher, and it says, these floods are really like impacting productive areas of the Chaco. And then you have as well, so these are like images from the Bajo Chaco, and then on the other side you have the Pilcomayo as well. So I was in the Pilcomayo in the upper right picture in February, and it was so dry and it was just crazy. And then 2 weeks later, massive floods, and this is the headline. It's just like these big flood and drought dynamics. So how do we deal with these issues and what's driving them? There's these big transcalar drivers that touch down on like local dynamics. One of them is just like prevalence of these rio voladores, so these flying rivers that are really about like the transport of precipitation and moisture from the Amazon. So coming off of the evaporation from the Atlantic, coming across the Amazon, and then as well getting transpiration from the Amazon and moving down. And you can see it a little bit differently in this image, where you have this big and historic transport system of moisture that comes across, and it helps feed the Amazonian rain systems, but then those also like feed further on down into the Chaco in southern South America. And that comes into play as well with the El Nino Southern Oscillation. So historic patterns of aridity and times of precipitation that have come to like mark the ecology of the Chaco, which is historically a dry scrub region, but also marked by interannual flood and drought periods. So floods and droughts are common. They occur regularly over time. However, they're intensifying greatly, like recently, for broader kinds of drivers and changes. And those being the deforestation of the Amazon, which is breaking down this flying river transport system. You have less evapotranspiration, less water is starting to come down from the Chaco. So you have more irregularity with what were common rainfalls, but also that's playing into global climate change, which impacts the El Nino Southern Oscillation, which is also like has big and dramatic effects on the duration and intensity of things like drought, and then like the timing of precipitation and precipitation events. And then you also have like on a much more local scale, like massive deforestation within Paraguay itself. So like looking at the Paraguayan Chaco being like one of the global deforestation hotspots and thinking about the ways in which that on like a microclimatic scale also impacts the transport and availability of water and aridity. So that's kind of like some of this context. And I'm talking about Paraguayan Chaco. So what's interesting is that there are these two big rivers. It's a largely dry scrub area. This is a drier part of the Chaco. This pink area is the humid Chaco, which has more interannual water presence and flood. You have two really large rivers, one draining out of the Pantanal, which is the Rio Paraguay, and the other one draining out of the Andes, which is the Pilcomayo. So we have these two big river systems coming down. And here's a very flat, almost no hills, sandy plain that drains historically out of the Andes. And so it's very susceptible to small amounts of precipitation, particularly when it comes very rapidly. So this is the Rio Paraguay. You can look at it. It's an enormous river. It's quite massive. That's looking north toward, somewhat toward Brazil. We're still down in, actually Brazil is on the right-hand side of the image, and Paraguay is on the left-hand side of the image. And this is the Pilcomayo River. On the right-hand side of the image is Paraguay. On the right-hand side of the image is Argentina. On the left-hand side of the image is Paraguay. So two very different rivers in their kind of like their flow and height, but also very significant for these kinds of natural systems and how they shape like social ecologies in these places. And so like what I've been thinking about for quite a long time, in addition to other work, is what are like the lived experiences of people in these kinds of waterscapes, and how are the creation of new or novel waterscapes, so landscapes, but also like as the way in which water interacts and flows in those spaces, so what some would call waterscapes, how does that actually like interface with people's lives? So I published a paper, or this is a picture that kind of just shows some of this dynamic waterscape in a sense, and I'll come back to it later. And this is from February of this year in a community that I've worked in for about the last decade. But just shows kind of some of these water infrastructures there. But I've been following this really since for the last few years, and derived out of my dissertation and turned into its own kind of curiosity and central interest, which is how people deal with these issues, right? And so this is the image on the left is this woman's, that's all of her water storage infrastructure that she has at her house. So like I did a study where I was basically quantifying like how many liters of water can people store with what they have at their home, where do they get their water from, and looking at like reported incidences of illness and those types of things, and relating that to periods of flood and drought, and doing that, and then also like looking at where those places that people actually get their water from. So a lot of it is from these subsurface or these surface ponds. They're called tajamares. Some of them are quite large. They look like little lakes. These are all man-made though, or human-made. And so this is like very muddy and very dirty. This one has also like quite muddy and dirty. But the point is that people are getting their water from surface areas, and so they're very susceptible to these flood and drought periods. When there's drought, the water gets concentrated or disappears, and there's a high prevalence of incidents of reported illness because you're drinking mud and things of that nature, like literally. And then when there's flood periods, everything washes into and across the landscape, so it gets all mixed up, and people report other kinds of illnesses at that time because you're having like latrines and trash and dirt and all the sediments and all this stuff mixing together into these spaces that people are drinking. And so we mapped out, actually, it's hard to tell at the resolution here, but we mapped out the creation of these tajamares across this entire landscape to look at the ways in which mostly cattle ranchers had created a new waterscape that impacts indigenous water access and justice. So I've been thinking about that for a long time, and more recently thinking about how people adapt to climate change and living with these kinds of conditions. And so some of the like traditional approaches to adaptation are more like these like punctual, like at the moment, like how are we going to deal with a problem kind of thing. They're not like structural changes or thinking about how we actually like help people be more resilient, but it's about trying to enable people to make it through this one shock and seeing what happens after that. So on the left-hand side, you see an image from January of this year of hundreds of trucks filled with water coming from Asunción and driving into the Chaco. They're lining up to drive in the Chaco, go to indigenous communities, and they unload the water into tanks, like you see on the right-hand side, oftentimes it's big blue tanks. And that's another initiative as well, saying like, we're going to help with water security, we'll give people these tanks. And so this is a very common thing, instead of like thinking about the broader structural issues, which are shaped by land tenure and the inability to actually move to access certain types of water. They're shaped by the fact that subsurface water in a lot of these areas is actually saline or brackish, so you can't put in a well and drink it. You have to rely on water capture systems. And then also it's shaped by the flood and drought and the timing of water. But the problem is, you can't really see it there, but the problem is that those big blue tanks often end up like this. So they break, I've seen it in many communities where people have had these big blue tanks over like the last like 10 to 15 years, like running around in the area, like seeing these all the time. And it's great to get a new tank, but it's also not a really durable solution. And so part of the work that I've been trying to do is think about like, what are these durable solutions? Some communities have the ability, very few communities have the ability to build these kinds of infrastructures. So what you see here is called a tanque australiano and a tajamar. This thing right here, this tanque australiano, is an Australian tank developed, and the technology developed in Australia. And it's probably like 5 or 5 to 6 meters tall and like quite large across. And so the point is, and this is quite large. This is about like 70 meters long, no, 50 meters long, something like that, and carved out. And so what you're doing is letting this fill with water, and then you pump this up to here, and this fills up, and then it's gravity fed out to houses and things like that, or pastures. It works really well for a lot of purposes, but they're very expensive. They're actually also like hard to maintain to ensure like you have a reasonable water quality within them. And it's just like almost no communities, indigenous communities, very few have them in the Chaco. There are some in the central Chaco near the Mennonite colonies that have those. This is a community that used funds from an international human rights court case to invest in their own community to build them. This is built just this year. And this is from February of this year in one of those communities where I've been doing some of that work previously. So this is a bit more durable and more lasting, but yet it's very expensive and difficult. So just been thinking about like what else is possible. I had an NSF career grant that was recommended for funding and then not given like current political stuff, but it was really thinking about like how indigenous communities across the Chaco adapt to flood and drought, and like what is the relationship between those with regard to these other conservation initiatives. So I was looking at these big like climate change conservation efforts and initiatives in the Chaco of different types, and I wanted to see if there is a relationship between those initiatives and their kind of like their payments and the types of social programming that they have on the ability to improve in adaptive capacity, and also to think about like what a biocultural approach to adaptive capacity to climate change would look like within indigenous communities. So you have on the left these big carbon forestry credit programs, so carbon credit programs like REDD+, payments for conserving forests, and on the right you have this other dynamic that's going on in the Paraguay and Chaco is prospection for lithium. And so thinking about lithium as like a climate change adaptation because of batteries and decarbonization and things like that. So you have these two interesting dynamics coming into play in the Paraguayan Chaco. And so thinking about what that looks like, right? So you have these large scale REDD+ projects in Paraguayan Chaco that are starting to unroll, and also a state-led initiative to certify indigenous forests for sales to international carbon markets, and then use those funds ostensibly within communities to like support their own climate change adaptation and livelihood projects and things like that. This is a private company here that's investing in their own projects in the Chaco. And these are some of the state-led programs and some of the things that I've been talking about and looking at that. So the idea is to continue. I'm still planning to continue this work, but we're still looking for other ways to move forward. So really asking and trying to assess like what are the actual effects of these kind of payment programs on indigenous adaptive capacity. And then the other side is looking at this, which is was revealed, well, particularly revealed through the recent drought period or dry period. So you can see the full extent of these lagunas saladas, these big salt lakes. But it turns out the big salt lakes and the salty water under the ground, which is the reason why people can't drink the water, has lithium in it. And so like looking for, there's a massive prospecting period right now going on for lithium in the Chaco of Paraguay. So the salts in this that you see here also potentially have like significant lithium. So you have the historic lithium triangle, which is Bolivia, Argentina, and northern Chile. But now there's an argument that there's a new lithium triangle, which also includes the Paraguayan Chaco. And so you see on the right-hand side, the Paraguayan Chaco, and all what those little gray polygons are already like licensed sites for prospection and looking for lithium. So here we have all these different technologies being enrolled. So one is like actually wells and pumping out water and looking for and thinking through. And then this other one is this big orange ball is one that they carry with a helicopter, and it does some sort of like geomagnetic like reflectivity and like scanning of soils and things like that. And you can see on the right-hand side as well, this is the green, the shades of greens in this kind of yellow is the deforestation and standing forest. These kinds of yellow are all areas that have been approved for lithium prospecting. So it's going on in those places. All these red polygons are also indigenous communities and territories that are titled. So looking at and thinking about how people are starting to navigate climate change adaptation, but also the effects of these kinds of industries as well, for good or for otherwise. And so some of the question in that is like, are these climate change mitigation strategies related to, or how are they related to adaptive capacity? There's a bit of a disconnect in some of the literature on that. Yet there is more of a connection of thinking about like biocultural heritage as facilitating adaptive capacity and vice versa. So like, how does climate change mitigation and the benefit, the economic benefits or social benefits from that, can that influence or support biocultural heritage and the preservation or maintenance of that by indigenous peoples for indigenous peoples, and how does that then relate to adaptive capacity? And can those things come together to create like more climate justice outcomes? It's kind of like the question. That was a big part of those, like the core theorizations and questions in the proposal that we're now looking for more funding for. So I'll stop there. We have 2 minutes, so no worries, no questions, all good. But thanks for listening. Sorry to keep you the time. Appreciate it. Gracias. Obrigado.